when I first started studying with Paul this year, he sort of changed everything about my practice routine, which was really good, actually. It just kind of made me come at the clarinet from a completely different perspective. But nowadays, when I warm up, I play 5 minutes of long tones and a barto studies. I think that's what they're called. And that just helps warm up the instrument more than anything else. And I was talking about warming up with a friend who plays in the West Australian Symphony Orchestra, and he's a French horn player, and he reckons that warming up only happens for the first 5 minutes that you spend playing your instrument, which is kind of true. And then he says the rest of the time that you spend warming up, or the first 20 minutes of your day, or the first 20 minutes on your instrument, are always you just work on technique. So whether that be breath control or phrasing, or sorry, not phrasing, air control. Phrasing is musicality, not technicality. Whether you work on any of those, technically the warm-up part of your morning routine or your first thing in the day routine only happens within the first 5 minutes. So that's kind of how I treat warming up. Like I just make sure that I get loads of air through the instrument. And sorry, there's just heaps of things going on. Lots of people watching. Great. That's how I treat my warm-ups. I try and do the same thing every day for the first 5 minutes that I play, but I also allow for flexibility, mainly just because I'm easily distracted. So I like having variety in my routine. But the first 5 minutes is always the same. Long low E's, loud low E's, some crescenti exercises, some barto exercises. It's just really good for the instrument, good for your chops as well. And then I usually move on to some scales, or recently I've been doing some Joost Michaels. I'm not German, so I can't pronounce that properly. Yeah, just to get my fingers moving, especially on cold days. I find that I move into scales more than anything else. And then slower excerpts are a big part of my morning routine, or my first thing in the day routine, especially on a clarinet. I try and make that a big priority. What gear are you playing on? Great question. Every time someone asks this, I have a bit of a giggle, because another friend of mine absolutely hates it when someone asks him about what gear he plays on, but I don't mind it. So I'll answer the question. So I play on festivals, buffet festivals, and I play on a B40 lyre mouthpiece with a, what's this called? Bernard, rose gold ligature. And the reeds that I'm playing on, if you've been watching, are D'Addario Reserve, Classic Reserves and Reserve Evolutions, both size 3.5, strength 3.5. And I haven't really, that's been a recent change. That's only been in the last 11 months that I've been using those, and I really like them. I used to play on Van Durens. I was a religious Van Duren user until 11 months ago, and then I just decided to change. I used to play on 56, and I really like them. I'd still go back to them if I ever decided to use Van Durens again, because they're super good. I really, really enjoy using them. But not anymore. I just decided to try something else, and really enjoyed being able to play on 6 to 8 reeds out of the box instead of 3 with the Van Durens. So that's why I changed. So someone asked last night, do I stand or sit while practicing? And they said that they've been standing, but what do I think? I think it just depends on you. Sorry, that's not super helpful, but The reason why I say that is because standing up is great if you're focusing on posture. It's harder to focus on posture while playing if you practice sitting down all the time. But for me, I've been working on posture while sitting down, so I sit down while I practice. And sometimes I just don't have any energy, so sitting down is way more relaxing. When I started studying with this new teacher, Paul, this year, he got me to stand up while I was playing, always. And that was super helpful because I was working on posture quite a bit and also working on breath support. And it's easier to focus on that when, in my experience, when you're standing up. Simon! Hi, Simon! So that's kind of what I think about sitting versus standing in your practice. I have found, curiously, that if I'm practicing articulation, standing up helps more because I can focus on, again, breath support and making sure that I'm not holding tension up here when I'm practicing articulation, which is one of my biggest problems at the moment. I'm trying to just work on loosening up in general. So sitting down is great if you have a supportive chair or if you're actively engaging your core muscles while you're sitting down. And usually what that means is that you have to have your feet flat on the ground while you're practicing, just to help stabilize everything from your waist down. And Brandon's here too, hello. So yeah, that's what I think about standing versus sitting. And it's really a personal preference, but there's benefits to both. And I really should mix it up a little bit more. In my own practice, I tend to just sit down. Nothing wrong with that. I just think it could be more useful for me to do some more standing up practice. A question from Danny: how would you work on articulation as a beginner, intermediate player? Good question. I definitely... another good read. It's tricky because I definitely struggled with articulation as an intermediate player. Still do. It's still one of the things that I really need to work on. I would say it's more important that you learn what the correct action is of articulation. So for me, it's always been making sure that the tip of my tongue is at the tip of the reed. And one of the easiest ways to practice that is to practice repeated notes. So you could just start on an open G and try and position your tongue as close to the reed as you can. And then work on legato tonguing on the reed so that you get used to the feeling of where the tongue is sitting on the reed. So the very tip of your tongue on the very tip of your reed. And just practice some open Gs. Don't worry about speeding it up too soon because, like I said before, it's more important that you understand what the action is and what the correct action feels like and sounds like. And some things that you can do to check that. Amy's here. Hello, Amy. What you can do to check that is when you're practicing this technique and you're having a look at where your tongue is sitting on the reed, you can, there are three things that are the most important to remember about practicing articulation. The first is that you need way more air than you think you need. And the reason for that is because the sound of articulation doesn't come from your tongue hitting the reed. It comes from your tongue releasing off of the reed. So in order for your tongue to release and actually make that sound, there needs to be quite a lot of air pressure behind the tongue. At least that's the way that I've been taught how to think about articulation. Hi Anna, Anna's here. So if that makes sense, so lots of air, the tongue at the very tip of the reed, the very tip of the tongue at the very tip of the reed, and also, what was the other thing? I just had a mind blank. Classic, this always happens. I don't know what I was, good lord. Tip of the tongue, lots of air. I was meant to say something else, but I forgot. But those two things are very important, so if you do those, you'll be okay. And so what I do when I practice faster articulations is that I make sure I'm supporting from below, and I just practice some open Gs. I start at crotchet equals, or quarter note equals 60, and I practice, so dividing the beat into 2 and then dividing it into 4, and then I do that with a range of different tempos. And so it's also important to remember that your embouchure should be stable the whole way through. So that doesn't mean it should be rock solid, but it should be stable so that your articulation can just happen almost automatically. So practicing with the metronome is really important. I'm a big advocate for that. And well, I would just also have a look at the repertoire that you're playing. Or a thumb rest just fell off. Classic. Have a look at the repertoire that you're playing, Danny, and isolate those trickier, faster articulation passages. And if you can, break them up into smaller sections and then gradually add more sections to them. So if you have, let's say, one bar that's all semiquavers tongued at 120, see if you can tongue all of them at 60. And then a couple of different ways you can practice it. You can either keep pushing the tempo up little by little, or you can start at 120, play the last group of the bar at 120, all tongued, and then gradually add the rest of the bar, but from the back to the front, if that makes sense. That's kind of a useful way of practicing something. But yeah, I would say with articulation, just focus on getting the right action. And then identify what you struggle with the most. Is it repeated notes, fast repeated notes, or is it finger and tongue coordination? You can use the same technique that I was describing before to practice finger and tongue coordination. So let's say you're playing an F and an E. You can practice the articulation exercises in the same way. You don't have to do them on repeated notes. So I hope that's helpful. How do I work on air support? Zoe asked. Do you do a lot away from the instrument? I really should be doing more away from the instrument. A couple of the clarinets that I've had the pleasure of studying with this year at the Queensland Conservatorium, they actually do some breathing exercises. There's a method called the Wim Hof method, which is more of a meditation-based exercise that some of them do. And I think also exercise can be really useful in practicing breath control or just air support in general. I don't really practice it away from the instrument though, and I think that can be something that's super helpful for some people. I used to use a breath builder. I have no idea where mine is at the moment. But it's I'm sure if you're a brass player or a wind player, you know what a breath builder is. And I used to use that all the time. Like every day. Before I touched the instrument, I would always do a couple of exercises with the breath builder, which is really useful. That was one of the biggest I think the biggest turning point for me was when I realized just how much I was not supporting my air properly, and when I started practicing and started studying with Paul, that was one of the things that we worked on quite a lot. And he would often just get me to do some very deep breaths before practicing and before playing. In my first lesson with him, we spent about 10 minutes just working on breathing, and it's different for everyone, but some people it takes some people a really long time to understand how to breathe properly. It took me a couple of months. And yeah, it's different for everyone, but if you have access to a breath builder, definitely go and use that. But make sure someone tells you how to use it properly, otherwise it can actually do some damage. There was a question from someone last night that I wanted to touch on, especially if we're going to talk a little bit about musicians' health, which this person asked, how do you tackle self-confidence issues in relation to playing and performing? Ruby's here. Hello, Ruby. So self-confidence issues in relation to playing and performing. I resonate with this a lot because I've never been the type of person who just goes, oh, I'm so great at the clarinet, look at me, I can play all these things really well. You know, I've had to spend hours and hours in the practice room just kind of struggling. And that really takes a hit on your self-confidence. But what I would say in response to this question is, first of all, you are your own worst critic. So it's important to know that while looking at yourself and identifying the problems that you have is helpful and necessary if you want to progress as a musician, there's also the case of learning to identify what's not helpful. So for me, a mental thing that I'm working on at the moment is particularly with articulation, but also with other crappy techniques that I have to practice, is going, let's not make a big deal out of this, because at the end of the day, it's just another part of playing the clarinet. So you're just going to have to work on it. And as soon as you realize that, as soon as you go, oh, okay, this is actually something that I can control, it's something that I can work on, and it's going to get better because I'm going to keep working on it. As soon as you kind of relinquish that control or gain control in a way by recognizing those things, that immediately has an effect on your self-confidence, because you're taking ownership of your playing and of your journey to becoming a better musician. So that's one of the things that I've been thinking about quite a lot recently. And the other thing is to know that while music is very competitive and the industry is very competitive, and people kind of, people make a big deal about the fact that there are no jobs, and it's true, there are no jobs. That doesn't mean that you get to give up, because if everyone gave up, there wouldn't be any musicians. So how that ties in with self-confidence, I'll get to in a minute, but it's really important that you keep going when you're struggling, because you know, you have to recognize when you have to take a break and all of that. That's all good and well, as I've discovered recently. But at the end of the day, if you're working towards, you know, becoming a better musician, there's a level of discipline that comes with that, which you just have to do. You just have to get up in the mornings or in the evenings if you're an evening practice person like me. I love practicing late at night. If you just have to get up and practice and work at it, and recognizing that by doing that, you're taking ownership of your instrumental journey. The other thing that ties into that is that while the music industry is competitive, and while you have to sort of prioritize what you want to do with music. At the end of the day, yes, there are a lot of people out there who are doing the same thing and working towards similar goals, but your journey is unique as a musician. So that's something that I've been thinking about quite a lot recently, because I'm actually taking a break from study at the moment, which has been really helpful for me. And so that means that my goals are slightly different. But it also means that I tend to compare myself to other people quite a lot, which is sometimes is helpful, but at the end of the day, the only person that you should be worrying about getting better than, I didn't say that very well, but you know what I mean. The only person you should be comparing yourself to is who you were yesterday. And that's kind of cliche, but it's true, because we all compare ourselves to everyone else all the time. And I think the more we can become confident in the ownership that we're taking of our own playing, the more we're just going to enjoy playing and performing. Because at the end of the day, I remember talking to my teacher about this right before I stopped studying. I started taking a break from studies. And he said, and I said, oh, but I just don't understand why I have to be the one to play the barrier sequenza. And he said, well, look at it this way. You getting up and playing the barrier sequenza is going to be completely different from anyone else who gets up and plays the barrier sequenza. You've got something to say with this piece of music, so why not put in the work to be able to play it really well and say something really meaningful with it? And that's really stuck with me, because at the end of the day, that's the aim. You have to be able to say something with the music that you make. And if you're not confident in your ability to do that, whether that be technical, musical, emotional, whatever, that's going to impact the impact that the music has on other people. I have a rule, or a what's it called? A deal with myself. And I don't always know if this eventuates in performance, but I always tell myself that if I can touch someone in some way, shape or form with my performance, I've achieved my goal as a musician. It's not always that easy, and it's taken me a long time to come to this way of thinking about it, but I hope that's kind of helpful. Kevin asked, how did you divide your time between school and practicing? So I'm guessing by school you mean academic work. Super hard, actually. It's really tricky. I try to just stick to, I look at my week. So at the moment I'm not studying, but when I was studying, I just made sure that I knew what was going on pretty much hour to hour in the week. So I would just plan that out in a diary and make sure that I knew when I had time to practice, and also made sure that I knew when I had time to rest, because I tend to just ignore that, and that kind of bit me in the ass, so to speak. So that's really important. Plan out your week and make sure that you just schedule your practice and your studying. That's probably the most helpful thing. I'm super not great at sticking to a schedule, even if I make it, but just having that mental organization really helps. So just make sure you know your schedule inside out and plan for things to go wrong and for things to take longer than they should, or take up more time than they should. But if you can practice at the same time every day, that's already a huge win, because that means that you are super tuned into your practice needs, and it just helps having that consistency. How do I achieve such a clear sound? With lots of patience. I'm super fussy with my reeds, as you've probably gathered. I hate having stuffy or fuzzy reeds, so immediately I just eliminate them. If that comes up, I either work on them, so I polish the backs, I just chuck them in the bin because I don't have time for stuffy reeds. I just can't stand them. That was the first thing that I did when I started working on my sound a lot more. And I actually just, this year when I was starting to work on my sound pretty much that was the only thing I did for about 3 months, is to play very loud. Because when I started studying with this new teacher, Paul, I adore his sound to the moon and back. I just think it's really beautiful and I wanted to sound like him. So he got me to play loud all the time. Like, we're talking fortissimo, triple F all the time. No matter what I was playing. If I was playing Mendelssohn's Scherzo, he'd want to hear it at fortissimo. And the reason for that is because he said that I wasn't using enough air and I wasn't putting enough air through the instrument, which then limited what I could do on the instrument. He's really big on being able to play extremes in every single way. Extremes of dynamics, extremes of character, everything. So for him, you have to start with the extremes and then work backwards and refine things that way. But in terms of sound, it really, really helps if you know what a well-supported sound feels like. So if you play fortissimo low E's for 5 minutes every day, by the end of probably 3 days, you'll realize just how much air you can put through the instrument. And that's kind of, well, that was the starting point for me. And then in terms of clarity of the sound, I guess it just kind of depends on what you're going for. I tend to prefer a sound that isn't cluttered. And so for me, that meant, first of all, working on my reeds, making sure that there aren't any fuzzy or stuffy reeds in there. And reeds that respond really well are really helpful. But also reeds that can withstand all the extremes that I want to impose on them. So reeds that have enough cane on them. And the other thing is making sure that the embouchure is really stable. So making sure that the corners of the mouth are always engaged around the mouthpiece. And I actually learnt this from a saxophone player, a classical sax player back where I'm from. I was working on some solo rep and I played some for her, and saxophone embouchure is very different, but it's also making a sound on the saxophone is very different, and you have to have a lot more control over your embouchure. So they're really great at explaining sound concepts because they have to be so pedantic. So she really got me to focus on the corners of my mouth, making sure that they're always engaged, but then also making sure that the jaw is flexible and relaxed. I'm sorry if this is like way too much detail. As you can tell, I love detail. I love talking about this. So that's kind of the basis of it. So first of all, just lots of air. Because as soon as you know how much air you can put through the instrument, it's a lot easier to scale it back than it is to scale it up. It took me a couple of months before I was able to play a low E at fortissimo for 12 seconds. It was really hard. I'm glad it's helpful. Yeah, so, and then I would just go and listen to people that you really like and try and imitate them. That was also a big part of my sound journey this year. I listened to a lot of singers and a lot of cellists, actually. So I went and listened to Jacqueline Dupre, Misha Maisky, although my teacher hates Misha Maisky, which is pretty funny. He says Misha Maisky plays with way too much vibrato. I don't really care. I think vibrato is great. Maybe not on clarinet though. Misha Maisky's Soul Get Better. Holy moly, if you want to hear a clear sound, go and listen to Soul Get Better. She's a cellist. I don't know what nationality she is, but she is phenomenal. Her Martinu concerto for cello and orchestra, super good. It's like one of my favorite things ever. So that's pretty much it. I love listening to cellists. Singers are a little bit harder because obviously they also use quite a lot of vibrato. But it can be helpful if you're looking to have some more depth in your sound and you're wanting to know how to do that. Singers are good to listen to for that.